Hello, everyone. We're going to give everybody just a few more minutes to join. So we'll be looking to start around 1:03. Thank you to everyone joining. We're giving everybody just a couple minutes to get in here. Thanks to everyone jumping in. We're going to be getting started around 1:03, just giving everybody a little more time to join. Thanks so much. Thank you to everyone joining. We're going to be starting just here shortly. Actually, it looks like we're right around 1:03. We have an action-packed agenda, so I want to make sure we go ahead and kick off. Thank you again, everybody who has popped in. I am Sarah Webster. I am your host for today's webinar, Procurement to Payment, the Blueprint for Audit-Ready Tax Compliance. Hopefully that's what you're here for. If you are not, you are in for a great conversation, so stick around. I wanted to share very quickly here Avalara's safe harbor and confidentiality statement before we move over to our agenda. Okay, so the goal of today's session is to have a really practical conversation about where AP and use tax challenges tend to show up across the procurement to payment process. um, why some of the approaches that we commonly hear many teams using may introduce friction or additional risk in that process, and how many of our organizations are then modernizing these processes without adding any unnecessary complexity in. We are very, very fortunate to have a couple of industry experts on today. So it's my pleasure to go ahead and introduce them. First, we've got Sachin Sharma, founder and CEO of ProcureDesk. He has spent many, many years working closely with finance and procurement teams that are growing and outgrowing these manual processes that we've talked about and need better visibility and control over their spend. He brings just a wealth of knowledge to this conversation, and I know we're all going to benefit greatly from that. Then we also have Avalara's own use tax product solution consultant, David Knuff. David has over 30 years of experience in sales and use tax and has helped organizations of every size possible scale and automate their tax compliance. I don't know about you guys, but I'm pretty excited to hear what these gentlemen have to say. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sachin to talk a little bit more about ProcureDesk.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate it. And welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining today. So we'll start briefly with talking just brief about what ProcureDesk is, and then I'll hand it over to David to talk about Avalara. So ProcureDesk is a spend management company that is focused on helping growing organization control their spending, whether it is through automation of their purchasing process or implementing or automating their accounts payable process. So most companies come to us when they are, growing and struggling with, I would say, typical cost control issues in terms of spending not approved, or you have a separate system for AP, separate system for purchasing, and they don't talk to each other, and there is efficiency loss because of that. So that's what we kind of focus on, is implementing a simple procurement process across the board to give you a simple process to look at cash flow visibility as well as where the opportunities might be to reduce spending. We are founded in 2018, based in Cincinnati, Ohio. 400 plus customers in North America. We process like billions of dollars of spend every year across the board for our customers. We are focused on different, serve customers across different verticals, whether it is construction, manufacturing, biotech, schools, and so on. So it's kind of across the board. We help our customers implement better procurement process. So with that, I'll hand it over to David to talk about Avalara.
Thanks, Sachin, and welcome everybody to this session. Appreciate you joining. Um, just going to kind of give an overview of Avalara to start with here. Avalara was created to alleviate the burden of tax compliance. We've been in business since 2004. We've managed more than 51 million documents and certificates in 2024. We have over 1,400 signed partner integrations. And in 2024, we had over 55 billion API calls that we handled, along with 6.6 million returns were prepared and filed on behalf of our customers. And we serve more than 45,000 customers over 75 countries. Avalara is headquartered in Durham, North Carolina, and we have 14 offices across the globe with 53,000 employees globally. Uh, Next slide here, just kind of here's some examples of some of the companies that Avalara helps to manage tax compliance.
I'm going to jump in right there for a second. We would love to hear, before moving into the next slide, how everyone is handling use tax currently. So you're going to see a poll pop up on the screen. We'd love to hear how you're managing those tax obligations. If you're doing it manually, if you have a software or system, or if we need to maybe dig a little bit more into what is use tax. So I'll give just a few seconds here to weigh in on your use tax management currently. Okay, ending that poll, it looks like a lot of people are doing it manually. So that gives us something to talk about. Back to you, David.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So today, our conversation is going to be centering around consumer use tax. So I wanted to start off by kind of level setting and just explain what is consumer use tax. So let's start by defining what is consumer use tax. Every state that has a sales tax also has a consumer use tax. Consumer use tax applies when taxable goods or services are used, stored, or consumed in a jurisdiction, but no sales tax was charged at the time of purchase. In those cases, you don't just get a free pass. The responsibility shifts from the seller to the purchaser, and your business must self-assess and remit the tax directly to that taxing authority. A few common reasons that vendors don't always charge the correct sales tax. First, the customer that doesn't have nexus. If the vendor doesn't have a physical or economic nexus, it isn't required to collect sales tax in a state. So you become responsible for paying that tax in the form of a consumer use tax. The second most common reason is when a customer is billed for an item or service that is delivered to multiple taxing jurisdictions. Take, for example, SaaS, software as a service. When you're billed for that, you're probably billed based upon your headquarters location. But in actuality, from a sales and use tax perspective, you really should be taxed based upon where the users are located and assessing or consuming that SaaS. Avalara's solution, AvaTax for Accounts Payable, can help with that. And the third item I like to mention here is that samples and free giveaways are another big area where companies owe consumer use tax. If you purchase inventory items with the intent to resell them to your customers, but you probably issued a resale certificate to them, so you probably didn't pay tax to your vendors. However, if you decide to give away items to maybe influencers or prospective customers, you generally owe consumer use tax based upon where those items are delivered to those prospective customers. Next slide. So next, I'm going to talk through some of the consumer use tax challenges that companies face from a tax and finance side when processing purchase invoices. So with over 10,000 taxing jurisdictions in the US alone and constantly changing tax laws and rates, consumer use tax compliance is easy to get wrong. And it adds real stress to an already resource-intensive AP process. Many customers of ours still rely on manual processes each month to determine taxability, calculate tax, accrue and file consumer use tax returns. So AvaTax for Accounts Payable could really help them to automate that process because use tax can be triggered from multiple sources, including invoices where tax was missing or charged incorrectly, vendors without nexus in a taxing jurisdiction, items delivered to one location but used across other locations like SaaS, free giveaways and promotional items, fixed asset movement. And because the rules and rates are changing frequently, staying accurate requires ongoing research. With all of those challenges and not having a consumer use tax solution, the audit exposure can be very significant. In my 30 years experience in public accounting, I would say about 80 to 85% of audit assessment dollars tie back to consumer use tax. So now let me send it back to Sachin to discuss some of the challenges customers face from a technology side.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. And appreciate the quick overview. It's always helpful to kind of visit it one more time. Um, so I think with that in mind, let's talk about what we see as common challenges from a tax compliance standpoint. And I'm going to talk specifically focusing on procurement, right, and AP and or what we call as procure-to-pay. So as we commonly see, the number one challenge from a compliance standpoint is having different systems or disconnected systems that don't talk to each other. So it's very common to kind of see you have legacy systems that are still being used for purchasing. You might have AP might have their own system, or maybe it's all going to an ERP eventually, but the context is lost. So for example, let's say you bought something for a service or whatever the case might be, right? Now, at the time of when you ordered that, you have some information that is required in terms of where the service needs to be delivered. What is the purpose of that? It's a maintenance. Is it a new capital purchase or whatever? To serve a new capital purchase and so on. And by the time it goes to AP, it just shows up as an invoice, right? So now, as a result of disconnected systems, you have siloed data. And what that means is you're kind of missing the context of what was the purchase and how, when tax is looking at it and trying to apply or figure out what tax should be, use tax should be calculated, it becomes a nightmare for in that case, right? Especially for cases where you have a direct pay permit or when you're paying the state directly, you're calculating your own use tax. You probably need all that information on tip of your finger. So when an audit happens, you're able to kind of go back to that, right? So let's take an example of what this means, right? Disconnected systems. So let's say we'll use a telco example. Let's say you're a telco and you're deploying, let's say, new equipment for expanding the service to new areas, and you're using a construction crew. That same construction crew is also used for maintenance of that plant, for example, right? So the maintenance would be taxed very differently versus the new capital build, as an example, right? So that process, if you don't have like a single system, which is kind of capturing everything from, okay, this is the service and this is for the new, capital project and so on. By the time, you get the invoice, you just see services performed and this is the amount and so on. You're missing the context. And that is what the challenge is, right? What that means from a tax standpoint is that the errors gets surface a little bit late, right? And remediation could be costly. So you're probably doing a year-end audit, trying to kind of close the books to see what use tax is kind of applicable. And at that time, you got to go look up a lot of information into it from a system standpoint. So what that means from a fragmented tax compliance standpoint, right? So number one is it increase your audit exposure, right? As I said, like, for example, if you are a direct pay company or, have a direct pay firm with the state, very few states have it now, but you probably will be audited more, right? Auditors will come and just ask for information around, hey, show me the invoice, show me how the tax was calculated and so on. And imagine at that time, your remediation effort would be so huge because now you got to go look up all the past information, dig up emails, reach out to people to understand the context and so on, and any supporting document, right? So this kind of, as the volume grows, this becomes a challenge, right, in terms of making sure that you are, stay compliant. And the end goal of this is if you're able to do this right, you're avoiding any tax liability, whether it is, you're under or overpaying the taxes or any penalty because of late payments and things like that. If you have a system or a process in place, you can capture all that. So with that said, we just want to talk about now is how a solution like ProcureDesk combined with Avalara can help you meet your tax compliance need and do it in a timely and I would say less labor intensive fashion, right? So you don't have to keep on adding headcounts in your tax department or hiring interns every quarter, right, to kind of solve for the tax compliance needs. So as I mentioned, our system is an end-to-end system, like it captures everything. So the first part of this is procure-to-pay, so that you have one process to capture everything, right? So requisitions, purchase orders, invoices, they are all connected. So you do not lose the context of why something was ordered, whether it was service, where it was delivered, and so on. So by the time the vendor sends the invoice, system automatically connects to the purchase order and has all the details of what all you need to calculate tax. Second is then it automatically calculates the tax for you, which we'll talk about in a minute. The second aspect of this is your expenses. A lot of time we see you have a lot of credit cards, so employees are spending on that, right? But it's missing the information. Was it billable? If it was billable, where the service was delivered and so on. So if you do not have I would say, tighter control over your purchasing process, and not everything is going through a requisition and a invoice process, you probably need to capture your expenses also, like your credit cards or reimbursements, to understand where the money is spent and how it should be taxed. So that's number two. Number three is the contracts. So a lot of times you might have specialized, I would say, negotiations with the vendors where you're kind of documenting how tax should be calculated. If you're tax exempt on certain things, it's always helpful to document that in the contract itself. Generally, this is the thing which gets the least importance in the negotiation, right? Everybody talks about the scope and the pricing, but if you have like a specialized tax treatment, that should be documented in the contract, and that should be linked to your purchasing process in a way that it can read from a contract and say whether it needs to apply any tax or not, right? So that is the additional layer of, okay, whether you need to even calculate the tax or not, or if you're tax exempt in certain cases. The fourth aspect of this is inventory. So now you might purchase inventory and move into like inventory account, but then it needs to be taxed based on the jurisdiction of where it was deployed. So we'll continue with the telco example where you might buy a lot of inventory for manage your equipment or build new services for your clientele, but if you are in multiple states, for example, each state has its own jurisdiction. So it came as an inventory, but when the inventory was actually used, you need to capture where it was used and so on, so the tax can be calculated accordingly. So as you can imagine, if you look at these four scenarios, right, doing this manually or doing this in siloed systems makes it a real big challenge for growing companies. So the way we kind of solve that, we'll just kind of jump into that. I will kind of hand it over back to David for a minute to talk about the Avatax accounts payable solution, and then we'll jump into back into this.
Thanks,
David?
Sach. Thanks, Sachin. Yeah, so there's a lot of complexities in the consumer use tax process. So that's part of the reason why Avalara built Avatax for accounts payable. What is Avatax for accounts payable? It's Avalara's consumer use tax automation solution that helps businesses to manage consumer use tax compliance faster and more accurately. It pulls transaction data from your AP or procurement system, identifies where tax was under or overcharged, and calculates the correct use tax, reducing audit exposures, minimizing liability, and preventing overpayments. The next slide here. Now let's take a little bit deeper dive to see how Avatax for AP solves these challenges. First, it allows you to identify, calculate, and correct overcharged and undercharged vendor tax. Because manually verifying tax rates on each coming invoice can be impossible. Avatax for accounts payable checks rates according to the taxing jurisdiction, product taxability, and any special rules that may affect the transaction. And it identifies and corrects tax on purchases to keep you from underpaying or overpaying consumer use tax. It also has a centralized configuration within the Avatax dashboard and has built-in rates and user-defined rules to automatically determine tax obligations across multiple locations. It also provides a single location in which to view, act on, and report on purchase transactions, thus allowing you to create a centralized source of use tax related data, and it maintains a clean audit trail of your self-assessment decisions. It also allows you to manage data from multiple transaction sources, run liability reports, and create audit readiness reports. In addition, it seamlessly works with other Avalara applications, including vendor exemptions, managed returns, Avalara tax research, just to mention a few. And Avatax for accounts payable is built on our unified Avalara platform, where our business applications work together to provide a seamless experience, thus eliminating the need to export information from one platform and upload it into another platform. Next, we're going to be walking through some screens in the Avatax for accounts payable platform. So let's take a look at the Avatax, the AP dashboard, or I like to refer to it as a workbench, because this is where you can see, review, and act on exactly how your purchases were taxed. Over to the left side of this screen, you can see the document code or invoice number, as many people would call it. From there, you go on, you can see the date of the transaction, the current status of the transaction, and the vendor who you purchased from. Then over on the right-hand side, these right 6 columns, this is where we do all of our calculations. The total amount is typically the line item amount. We'd like to ingest the data at a line item level because we know our customers could have both taxable and non-taxable items on the same invoice. So we want to be able to make determinations and differentiate on those invoices, those line items. The next column is the taxable amount. This is what Avalara determined to be taxable based upon our rules and logic that we configured in the solution. The charge tax, the next column, is the vendor charge tax or the sales tax. Then the next column over to the right is the calculated tax, is the amount of sales tax that Avalara calculated and expected to be charged by the vendor. Then what we need to do in this solution is we need to compare what Avalara calculated with what the vendor actually charged. And that variance is the amount of sales tax charged by the vendor compared to what Avalara calculated. If the variance is a negative amount, it means that the vendor overcharged sales tax. And if the variance from what Avalara calculated and what the vendor charged is a positive variance, that signifies that the vendor undercharged tax. And then the final column over to the right is the unpaid tax. These are the amounts of consumer use tax that's due to the taxing authority. And if you're using Avalara's managed return service, we could take this amount right out of here and file that consumer use tax return. On the next couple of slides, we're going to talk through some examples of common rules that customers use. The first one I'm going to talk about are some of the out-of-the-box standard rules. So on this screen, we have the ability to use some standard logic and rules configuration. For example, the first one there, set up vendors. Some of our customers will say, we know that everything that we purchase from this vendor is taxable, or everything that we purchase from this other vendor is always exempt. So we can set up rules that ensure that sales tax is properly charged by the vendor, or if it's not charged, we'll calculate the proper consumer use tax. Some of our other customers will say that general ledger accounts and cost centers or departments are really what we use to identify how an item is going to be used in our process. Therefore, that really dictates if the item is taxable or exempt. Uh, Also, looking down here on the list, you can see the setup items. Some customers will have the ability, and if you're already using AvaTax on the sales tax side, you might be familiar with this, but on the purchases side, you could also map the description of the items that you are purchasing directly to an Avalara tax code. And just like if you're using Avalara to calculate sales tax on the sales side, on the purchases side, this products and services that you're purchasing can be mapped to an Avalara tax code. And Avalara tax codes are maintained, meaning that if a state changes its tax treatment of an item, Avalara updates our tax treatment real time based upon the effective date of that change. Um, and so as you can see, we really have the ability to set up some commonly used rules right out of the box. However, for those customers that want more complex rules or logic to make accurate taxability determinations on the items that they're purchasing, they can combine or layer these rules to get to a more granular taxability determination. So on the next slide, I'm going to show an example here. This is an example of a manufacturing customer. This customer had a facility, a manufacturing facility located in Cleveland, Ohio. This customer was audited by the state of Ohio. And during that audit, the auditor identified a compliance gap. The customer had a manufacturing exemption, but they did not realize that items used in their maintenance department or cost center were taxable in Ohio. So the auditor assessed them tax plus interest and penalty on these maintenance items. Then the customer came to Avalara and said, what can we do to fix this compliance gap so that I don't have these issues on my next audit? And after we spoke with them for a little bit, we determined that making taxability determinations based upon GL accounts and cost center combination would resolve this issue. So on this screen, we set up a rule here that says if we purchase something and it's charged to this manufacturing account and this cost center combination, assign the Avalara tax code, this P with the 7 zeros after it, which is our tax code for taxable tangible personal property, and we'll calculate consumer use tax based upon this Cleveland, Ohio rate, because that's where the facility is located. This rule will ensure that all purchases posted to this GL account and cost center combination are either charged the correct sales tax by the vendor or we calculate consumer use tax due. So it really does plug that compliance gap that that customer had, and they shouldn't expect to have this issue pop up in their next time the state of Ohio comes into audit. So on the next slide here, we're going to talk through another example of a commonly used rule for customers purchasing SaaS, software as a service. Because as I mentioned earlier, SaaS is generally taxed by the vendor based upon the customer's headquarters location. However, SaaS should actually be taxed based upon where the user of the software was accessing the software from. In this example, the customer is buying NetSuite from Oracle, and the software was billed to the customer's headquarters location in Cleveland, Ohio. However, they had users of this software not only in Ohio, but in California, Indiana, and Florida. And so you could see over to the right, the bottom right-hand corner, we associated or allocated the percentage of total users of that software based upon the taxing jurisdiction that they're located in. And our software, again, is intelligent enough to know that SaaS is taxable in Ohio, but not in Indiana, California, or Florida. So in this particular example, only 40% of the software is being used in a state that taxes SaaS, and 60% is used in a state that doesn't impose sales or use tax on SaaS. So if we go back, if we look at the next slide here, which we already kind of looked at earlier, this is back to that dashboard. But on this first transaction here, this SaaS example, here you can see that we only calculated tax on the Ohio users, or 40% of the invoice, since 60% of the users are in states that don't impose a sales or use tax on SaaS. So as you can see here, this helps to resolve that compliance gap. And in this particular case, this customer would have been overpaying tax to their vendor. So this helps them to plug that compliance gap. And then on the next slide here, we did walk through some of the basic standard rules out of the box and layering some of those standard rules, but we do have customers that need or have more complex purchasing scenarios. So in this other screen here, this is where you have the ability to create complex rules using any field of information from your accounting system. This screen is another way to configure rules and logic, and it really allows customers to add user-defined fields. As I mentioned earlier, you could add any field from your accounting data to use to make taxability determinations. So on the last slide here, or the next slide here, I should say, this is an example of one of our customers that wanted that more complex rule. This customer was a construction contractor. They were doing work in Texas. They needed rules configured that looked at very specific fields to determine if they owed tax on items used in Texas construction contracts. They needed to differentiate taxability based upon, and I'll just go down these different user-defined fields, commercial versus residential. The second one was contractor versus service. The third was new construction versus remodel. And then there was lump sum versus time and material, and then the state of Texas. So this rule was set up and it read in basically these five fields of information into the tool, and it read these rules and it said if all of these criteria are met, we're going to self-assess consumer use tax on the materials that were used in that construction contract. So now let's turn back to Sachin to talk more about the integration with ProcureDesk.
Thank you, David. So, as you saw, like in say, Avalara is a very comprehensive system when it comes to tax calculation and the different rules that you can apply. Now, you can always, import your data into Avalara, but with this integration, we have made it simple so that you can configure your rules either directly in Avalara or in ProcureDesk, and it can calculate tax automatically for you. So just to put the flow together in terms of what to expect from this integration is you will go to ProcureDesk to manage your purchasing in AP. So let's say I need to buy some service. You go to ProcureDesk and create a request for that service. It'll go through the review and approval process, what you might have set up in terms of your delegation of authority, whatever approvals you need internally, whatever your procurement processes can be baked into that. Then a purchase order is issued to the vendor automatically by the system, right? So that's kind of step one. Now, when the invoice comes in, let's say you might have an inbox, AP inbox where you're receiving invoices, or you need a supplier portal to submit your invoices. All that is kind of part of the solution so that we can ingest all the invoices from different vendors. When the system receives the invoice, it can then match it to the purchase order number that's kind of mentioned on the document. So we use OCR AI to pull all the information, automatically match it. So it considerably reduces the effort you might be putting in right now to key in your invoices and so on. But the main thing here is now, since it is integrated with Avalara, it allows you to now call Avalara and calculate the tax in real time. So there's no need for you to wait for the process to be completed, then export the data, and then get the tax information back, its work in real time. And that's what we will talk about, right? So the tax calculation is done by the Avalara engine, and then we do the validation and reporting, including any sort of general entries that we need to do for accrual taxes, right? So if you have an account for accrual taxes, we can just keep on putting there. And then that way, at the end of the day, you can run a report because it's already taken care in your liabilities. So let's look at some of the screens in terms of what's available in ProcureDesk and what to expect. In the interest of time, I'm just going to keep it to minimum slides. So here is a screen where you're actually configuring, where the tax needs to be accrued. So you make a journal entry, we can kind of manage it that way. You can also set up a default tax code for, if like gets a catch-all. So if you do not have any rules defined where, tax should be added, if you have any different list of entities, for each entity, you can have different set of rules, including any sort of different tax for, let's say, freight versus general material purchase and so on. So that's kind of the central configuration. Then very similar to Avalara, we allow the users to kind of manage what tax should be applicable to different kind of scenarios, because the purchasing is happening in ProcureDesk. So we just want to kind of give you a easy setup. So for example, if you're setting up a catalog for most commonly purchased product or service, for each item that you're setting up, you can just set up and say, if this item is used, then this is the tax that you should be using, right? So the tax codes from Avalara, what David mentioned before, are automatically available here. There is no need to do any sort of manual sync and so on. Similarly, you could do it on a category basis. So if you recall, we talked about different, if you might be buying same thing from or different things from the same vendor, and based on what it is, it probably goes to a different tax code. So that is where the category structures comes into picture, right? So for example, if you're buying hardware for internal consumption versus customer installation, you probably have different tax rules. So what you can do is you can set up what we call category codes here with the tax code, so it automatically calculates based on what is being purchased, unless you have set up like an item rule or something like that. And then the other thing you could do is, if nothing else, you can capture it at a supplier level. So you could just say, for this supplier, we want to use this tax code. And the system is smart enough to kind of figure out what level of detail are you providing. Because if it is, if there are multiple rules, it has a hierarchy of how it kind of applies, right? So it'll first go to the item, it'll probably then look at the category, and finally, if nothing else, it'll go to the supplier, right? That's the kind of sequence in which the system determines the tax. So that's the rules and the configuration, but what's the experience you're going to see? So here's an example of an invoice that has been already imported in ProcureDesk, right? So this is the AP module. This is already tied to the purchase order and everything else. And then you just hit the Avalara button here and it calculates the tax. So this calls Avalara in real time and calculates the tax. It's going to return the tax code and the tax rate that has been applied and so on. It calculates at a line level. So if there are multiple lines in this invoice, for each line, you're going to see like separately broken down what rules were applied and so on. All that granularity from Avalara is also maintained here. And then finally, we calculate the difference, right? So like, what was the sales tax added by the supplier? What is the use tax you should have paid? And it calculates the delta based on that. And then accordingly, we will kind of add a accrual entry in your, like a journal entry. So that way, you know what is paid and what is yet to be paid. All this is automated. You can set up the calculation either manual, where you just press a button and it automate that for you, or you could just set up triggers in ProcureDesk where you can say, like at the time of submission of the invoice, like once AP has reviewed it and you're submitting it, it will automatically calculate the tax for you, right? So that's kind of another way of calculating that. So just to kind of summarize what we have discussed so far, ProcureDesk and Avalara kind of brings it all together, where you have best-in-class tax solution combined with best-in-class procurement solution, and you're not doing this in two separate systems. So from a ProcureDesk standpoint, it kind of manages the context of what is being purchased, what is the use of that, where it is used, and so on. And it flows through the entire transactions all the way to the invoicing process. From there, invoice kind of is sent to Avalara to calculate the tax, and then it kind of calculates everything, maintains the delta, and also integrates the data back to your accounting system. So that's kind of on the ProcureDesk section. David, I hand it over to you for Avalara.
Yeah, on the Avalara side, really, it help our solution identifies, calculates, and corrects overcharged and undercharged vendor sales tax and accrues consumer use tax for the U.S. and Canada using location information, item classifications, and category data. And this really allows our customers to support audit readiness and have detailed transactions ready. And on the next slide here, I'm just going to show one of the quick reports. This is one of the audit readiness reports that we could generate in AvaTax for accounts payable. And in this example, this report I find very helpful because, again, it shows the amount of sales tax in the left column here, the left highlighted column, charged by the vendor at a line level detail. And on the far right column here, it shows the tax amount that Avalara calculated. And then the middle yellow highlighted column, it shows the line amount of consumer use tax that was remitted to the taxing authority in the form of consumer use tax. So it really does provide that auditor with the sales tax charged by the vendor as well as the consumer use tax that you're paying. So it's a really helpful report. And then in conclusion here on the next slide, this is Avalara does offer a free use tax help check. If you're interested in having up to a 60-minute call with one of our Avalara tax experts, please feel free to scan this QR code and enter your information, and we'll reach out to you and have those discussions with you.
Awesome. Thank you, David. And just to kind of conclude, as I said, this is kind of scan the QR code on the screen now if you want like a free audit. I'll leave it here for a minute, and then I'll just kind of switch to our final slide. So again, if you want to just kind of book an assessment or want to see how ProcureDesk and Avalara combined can help you with tax compliance, scan the QR code and book some time to kind of talk to our product specialist. With that, I'll hand it back to Sarah to see if there are any questions that have come up, and we can address them.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you both so much. That was wonderful. I can't even tell you how excited we at Avalara are about this integration and this partnership. So I learned a lot. I hope all of the attendees learned a lot as well. As we move into the Q&A, I want to do a couple things. If I know we're coming close on time, if you have questions but you know you need to jump to another call, that's no problem. Pop them in the Q&A. If we don't get to them here, we'll compile the questions and answers and send them out in a follow-up email to everybody. So just feel free to pop them in. And then I'm also going to post one more poll for everyone, and that's just going to be if you would like Avalara to contact you, if you would like ProcureDesk to contact you, or if you would like both of us to contact you. So I see some questions trickling in while I leave that up. The first does look like it is probably for ProcureDesk. So it's just asking again at the beginning, we found out that people are using different spreadsheets. So they asked, we are currently using a bunch of different spreadsheets. How does moving to ProcureDesk help me stop using them?
Sure. So thanks for the question. It's very common to see for our clients to have multiple spreadsheets as they are kind of dealing with, I would say, different set of processes, right? So tax might have their own spreadsheet for calculating tax. AP has its own, procurement has its own, and so on. So we're very familiar with that world. What we try to do is kind of work with you to assess what is an optimum workflow that would help streamline the process end to end. So rather than looking at it more like a silo of how do we do AP better or how do we do tax better or how we do procurement better, we look at more from an end-to-end standpoint and said, how do we optimize your entire procure-to-pay process for this? And that starts with an assessment. We look at the workflow and then we implement the tool to kind of move everything from all the spreadsheets into a streamlined procurement system.
Awesome. Thank you. Looking at the few other questions that have come in. So David, I think this one is for you. How long does it take to set up AP for consumer use tax in Avalara?
Yeah, it's pretty quick actually. our onboarding process that we use at Avalara to get customers onto the AP solution here really generally consists of about three calls. The first call is kind of an information gathering call. The second call is really just, kind of making sure that everybody's aligned in setting up the system. And then the third call is really just kind of testing to make sure everything's working properly. So from the Avalara side, it's a pretty straightforward process with really just those three calls. Thanks.
Excellent. Very cool. Okay, so I know that we are right here at time. I do see a couple other questions, so we will answer those post-webinar. Again, big thank you to Sachin, to David, to Greg and Pedro, who have been our backstage crew to really make this happen, and of course to all of the attendees. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions, and thank you so much for joining. I hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thanks all.
Yep.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Sarah.
everyone.
Thanks so much.